This is the bleeding portrait of Belgravia, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the heart of darkness. First, we would like to greatly thank our listeners from all over the world. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and write a comment where you are from. A portrait bleeds secrets the living cannot afford revealed. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The House Where Beauty Lives. The house stands at the finest corner of Belgravia, cream stucco glowing like aged ivory in the June sunlight. Number 17. Chester Square is not merely a residence, it is a declaration. 5 stories of Georgian perfection, each window dressed with silk the colour of champagne. Each balcony wrought in iron so delicate it might have been spun by spiders with excellent taste. Wisteria cascades from the 3rd floor balcony in a waterfall of purple and white, releasing a scent so intoxicating that even the traffic on the square seems to slow as it passes, as though the motorcars themselves are pausing to inhale. Inside, the entrance hall is a cathedral of light. The floor is laid in alternating squares of white marble and black, polished to such brilliance that visitors instinctively glance down to ensure they are not about to step into water. A chandelier descends from the ceiling like a frozen explosion of crystal, each pendant catching the afternoon sun and scattering it across the walls in chips of rainbow. The air smells of white roses, which stand in a silver urn on the console table, and of beeswax, and of something more expensive that has no name. The particular scent of a house where someone cares, deeply and financially, about perfection. The drawing room occupies the entire 1st floor, and it is here that the world comes to be seen. The walls are hung in dove-grey silk. The furniture is French, 18th century, arranged in conversational clusters that suggest intimacy while maintaining the careful distances that wealth requires. Paintings hang in gilded frames, a Monet of water lilies that shimmers with blues and greens, so vibrant they seem to emit light rather than reflect it. A society portrait by Sargent of a woman in white who might be a ghost or an angel or merely very rich, and above the mantelpiece, a commanding the room with the authority of a general surveying a battlefield. The portrait. It depicts a woman of perhaps 40, though the years have been kind to her in the way they are kind only to those who can afford the finest maintenance. She sits in 3/4 profile, her head turned to gaze directly at the viewer with eyes of an extraordinary blue. The blue of morning glories, of Greek seas, of sapphires held up to candlelight. Her hair is dark and dressed simply, which only emphasizes the purity of her bone structure. She wears a gown of midnight blue velvet that pools around her like spilled ink, and at her throat a necklace of diamonds that catches the painted light with uncanny realism. The portrait is signed in the lower right corner, John Singer Sargent, 1926. But there is something else, and something that draws the eye and holds it with a peculiar magnetism. On the painted bodice of the gown, just above the heart, a stain. A dark crimson stain that spreads across the canvas in a shape disturbingly organic, as though the painted woman is bleeding, as though the portrait itself is wounded. Hercule Poirot stands before the portrait, with his head tilted at a precise 15-degree angle, his hands clasped behind his back, his patent leather shoes gleaming like black mirrors on the Aubusson carpet. He is dressed with particular care this afternoon. A suit of pale grey summer wool, cut in Saville row to accommodate his compact frame without a single wrinkle. A shirt of snowy linen. A tie of grey silk with a microscopic pattern that only reveals itself upon close inspection. His moustache, that magnificent edifice, has been waxed to architectural perfection. He is, he knows, impeccable. The setting demands it. You perceive the difficulty, Monsieur Poirot. The voice belongs to Lady Marguerite Harcourt, and it is a voice that has been trained to carry across ballrooms and opera houses without ever rising above a tone of exquisite refinement. She stands beside him now, a woman whose beauty the portrait has captured, but not entirely. For the portrait cannot convey the particular quality of controlled vitality that animates her, the sense that she is a force of nature that has consented temporarily to be civilized. She is dressed in ivory silk, a day dress that manages to be both modest and devastating, with pearls at her throat and wrists. Her dark hair is swept back from her face in a style that is simple and timeless, revealing the bone structure that caused Sargent to beg for the commission. She is 54 years old, though she could claim 40, and no one would contradict her. She moves through her drawing room with the ease of a woman who has never, in her entire life, been uncertain of her welcome anywhere. "I perceive it, madame," Poirot murmurs. "The portrait, it bleeds, and yet it does not." "Precisely." She gestures and he follows her gaze. The stain on the canvas is undeniable, a spread of dark red-brown that mars the painted velvet. And yet the surface of the painting is pristine. No damage, no alteration. Poirot steps closer, removes a pair of spectacles from his breast pocket with a flourish that suggests he is unveiling a surgical instrument, and examines the canvas. His fingertips hover above the surface but do not touch. He leans close enough to smell the varnish. Old varnish, undisturbed, and studies the edges of the stain where it meets the surrounding blue. There, at the boundary. Something his eyes register before his mind can articulate it. A sharpness to certain edges of the stain that sits oddly against the diffuse quality of others, as though two different processes have produced what appears to be a single effect. He files this observation away, says nothing. It is too early for conclusions. Conclusions reached too early are merely prejudices wearing the costume of logic. "The paint, it is original," he says softly. "There has been no addition, no vandalism. And yet the blood, it appears to come from within the painting itself, as though Monsieur Sargent had always intended this effect. But the provenance, it is secure, yes. This portrait has been examined, authenticated, celebrated. There was no such stain when first it was painted." "None," Lady Marguerite confirms. "I sat for 3 weeks in Sargent's Paris studio. The portrait was perfect, flawless. It hung in my late husband's gallery for 20 years without incident. And then, 6 months ago, I had it moved here to my private residence. And 3 weeks ago, I came into this room at dawn and found it as you see it now, bleeding." Her voice does not waver, but Poirot detects the finest tremor beneath the surface, like a crack forming in fine porcelain. "You have consulted experts." 4 of them, conservators from the National Gallery, a specialist from the Courtauld, a private restorer who works for the Royal Collection. They are unanimous. The painting is untouched. The stain is original, which is impossible because I stood beside Sargent as he painted the final brushstroke, and there was no blood. Monsieur Poirot, I do not believe in ghosts and I do not believe in miracles. I believe in human agency and human deception. Someone is doing this, and I wish to know who and why and how. Poirot removes his spectacles, polishes them with a square of silk from his pocket, and replaces them in their case. His eyes, very green and very sharp, rest on the portrait a moment longer, on those edges that trouble him, that whisper of two processes where there should be one. The painting, it was insured for £200,000. And you are the sole owner. A pause, so brief that only Poirot notices it. Yes. And there are others, perhaps, who have reason to take an interest in this portrait. In its value, at its provenance, its symbolic significance. Lady Marguerite's smile is a masterpiece of social control. There are always others, Monsieur Poirot. In my world, there are always others. That is why I have invited you to tea, and to meet them. She moves to the bell pull, gives it a single graceful tug, and the room prepares itself for company. Within minutes, the drawing room begins to fill with the sort of people who make the society pages read like mythology. The first to arrive is Dmitri Volkov, and he arrives the way certain men do, as though the room has been waiting for him and can now, at last, begin. He is perhaps 35, tall and broad-shouldered, with the face of a Tsarist prince and the wardrobe of a man who has read too many novels about Tsarist princes and decided to become one. His suit is by Anderson and Shepard, his shoes are from Lobb, and his cologne is something Russian and expensive that smells of leather and snow. His hair is golden, his eyes are the pale blue of winter sky, and when he smiles, which he does often and with calculation, he reveals teeth so white, and even that they might have been carved from ivory by a jeweller. "Marguerite," he says, taking her hand and raising it nearly to his lips, before releasing it at the precise, socially acceptable distance. "You are radiant, as always." Dmitri. Her tone is warm, but her eyes are watchful. "You know Monsieur Hercule Poirot, of course. By reputation, the great detective. I am honoured." Dmitri shakes Poirot's hand, and Poirot accepts it with the slightly wary courtesy of a man who distrusts excessive charm, the way a jeweller distrusts excessive sparkle. "Though I confess I am surprised to find you here. Has there been a crime? Or are we all suspects in some delightful mystery of Marguerite's invention?" "Monsieur Volkov is an art dealer," Lady Marguerite explains. "One of the finest in Europe. He specializes in Impressionist and post-Impressionist works. He has sold paintings to museums, to royalty, to gentlemen in America who have more money than wall space." "I am merely a broker of beauty," Dmitri says, though his expression suggests he finds the description both accurate and insufficient. "I connect the things that should be treasured with the people who can afford to treasure them. It is not a profession, it is a calling." "How convenient," Poirot murmurs. The next arrival is announced not by the butler, but by a sudden shift in the atmosphere, as though the room has taken a breath and held it. Celeste Duval enters, and the world arranges itself around her. She is perhaps 28, and she is beautiful in the way that causes accidents. Her beauty is not a feature, it is an event. She has the face that Renaissance painters attempted and failed to capture. Oval, symmetrical, with skin like polished marble and eyes of such a dark, liquid brown that looking into them feels like falling. Her hair is black and cut in the modern style, sleek and geometric, framing her face like a helmet made of silk. She wears a dress of emerald green that fits her the way water fits a glass. And as she moves across the room, every person present tracks her movement the way sunflowers track the sun. "Marguerite, darling," Celeste says, and her voice is low and slightly accented. French, but the French of nightclubs and expensive hotels, not of libraries or lecture halls. "I hope I am not late. Traffic in Knightsbridge was utterly vile." "You are perfectly punctual as always," Lady Marguerite says, and Poirot detects in her tone a warmth that is genuine and a guardedness that is more so. "Celeste, may I present Monsieur Hercule Poirot?" "The detective, but how thrilling! Marguerite, you did not tell me we were to be interrogated. I would have prepared an alibi." She extends her hand, and Poirot takes it briefly, noting the softness of the skin, the perfection of the manicure, the faint scent of jasmine. "Mademoiselle Duval is a model," Lady Marguerite explains. "She appears in the pages of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and on the walls of galleries when photographers are fortunate enough to capture her. She is also a dear friend." "Too kind," Celeste murmurs, but her attention has already shifted to the portrait. She drifts toward it as though magnetized, her expression shifting from social pleasantness to something more complex. "It is still bleeding, then?" "You have seen it before?" Poirot asks. "Of course. I was here when Marguerite first discovered it. I thought she was going to faint." Celeste reaches out as though to touch the canvas, then stops herself, her hand hovering an inch from the painted blood. It is grotesque and fascinating, like a wound that will not heal, or a secret that will not stay hidden. Poirot watches her hand, the steadiness of it, the practiced distance of the hover, the familiarity of a gesture that suggests she has stood before this portrait many times, in private, studying it with the attention not of a casual visitor, but of someone who knows precisely what she is looking at. "An interesting analogy," he observes. The third guest arrives with less spectacle, but more substance. Captain Simon Harcourt, Lady Marguerite's stepson from her late husband's first marriage. He is 42, and he carries himself with the particular weariness of a man who has spent his life being compared to someone else and found wanting. His face is pleasant without being handsome, his hair prematurely grey, his suit well made but not fashionable. He has the look of a man who has learned to be invisible in rooms where other people shine. "Mother," he says, and kisses Lady Marguerite's cheek with a dutiful affection that is real but undemonstrative. "I came as soon as I received your message. Is this about the portrait?" "In part," she says. "Seaman, this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot." Simon's handshake is firm and brief. "The detective. I have read of your cases, sir. Impressive work. Though I confess I'm surprised my stepmother felt the need to engage you. The portrait is a curiosity, certainly, but hardly a matter for Scotland Yard." "Monsieur Poirot is not Scotland Yard," Lady Marguerite says with a smile that does not reach her eyes. "He is independent and discreet." "Discretion," Simon says, "is certainly what this family requires." He glances at the portrait, and Poirot sees in his expression not curiosity but something heavier. Resentment, perhaps, or recognition. The fourth arrival is the quietest and the most observant. Evelyn Cross enters the drawing room as though trying not to disturb the air, a woman of perhaps 50, with a face that was once lovely and is now merely intelligent. She is dressed in grey, expensive but understated, with a single strand of pearls and no other adornment. Her hair is brown, turning silver, Her hands are ink-stained, and her eyes are the eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime watching other people be more important than she is. "Evelyn!" Lady Marguerite's greeting is genuinely warm. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," Evelyn says quietly. "Though I'm not certain why you need me. I'm hardly an expert on bleeding portraits." She turns to Poirot. "Miss Evelyn Cross. I was Lady Marguerite's late husband's personal secretary for 15 years. I now manage the charitable foundation he established before his death." "A position of considerable trust," Poirot observes. "Or considerable tedium, depending on one's perspective," Evelyn says with a faint smile. "But it is honest work, and I value honesty." "How refreshing!" Dimitri murmurs from across the room, and Evelyn's smile tightens. The final guest is announced by the butler with a tone that suggests he would prefer not to announce this person at all. Mr. Nicholas Carey. Nicholas Carey enters as though he owns the house and is considering whether to sell it or burn it down. He is perhaps 30, American, handsome in the aggressive manner of American film stars, with dark hair slicked back, a suit of midnight blue that fits him like paint, and the smile of a man who has been told he is charming so many times that he has begun to believe it is a fact rather than an opinion. "Maggie," he says, using a diminutive that makes Lady Marguerite's expression freeze for a microsecond before she recovers. "You're looking sensational, as always." "Nicholas." Her tone is glacial beneath the courtesy. "I did not expect you." "I know, but I heard you were gathering the old gang and I thought, why not? After all, we're all still family, aren't we? In a manner of speaking." He turns to Poirot, extends his hand with American informality. "Nick Carey, former husband of the goddess over there in the green dress. Still madly in love with her, but she's far too smart to take me back. Well, you must be the detective Maggie's hired to solve the mystery of the haunted painting. Spooky business. I like it." Poirot shakes his hand briefly, noting the strength of the grip, the faint scent of whiskey beneath the cologne, the quality of the watch on his wrist. Patek Philippe, worth more than most men earn in 5 years. Tea is served. It is not merely tea. It is a performance of tea, an exhibition of the ritual that separates those who understand civilization from those who merely participate in it. The china is Sèvres, so fine that light passes through it like stained glass. The tea itself is a blend from Fortnum and Mason, brewed to the precise temperature that releases flavour without bitterness. There are sandwiches, cucumber with the thinnest possible layer of butter, smoked salmon with dill, egg and cress on brown bread. There are scones, still warm, served with clotted cream from Devon and strawberry preserve made by an elderly countess in her Cotswolds kitchen. There are pastries from a French patisserie in Mayfair. Eclairs, millefeuilles, tiny jewelled tarts of lemon and raspberry. There is champagne for those who prefer it, served in coupes rather than flutes, because Lady Marguerite believes that beauty matters more than effervescence. Poirot accepts tea, declines the sandwiches, and selects a single eclair with the precision of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. He observes. Dimitri sits beside Lady Marguerite, angled toward her with the focus of a man who is either fascinated or performing fascination. He speaks in a low voice, gesturing occasionally toward the portrait, and she listens with the attention of a monarch receiving a petition. But Poirot notices. Her hand holding the teacup is not quite steady. Celeste perches on the arm of a sofa a position that is technically informal, but which she makes look like a pose from a magazine. She eats nothing, drinks champagne, and watches the room with the expression of a woman who is always aware that she is being watched and has learned to enjoy it. But when Nicholas speaks, telling some anecdote about a disastrous yachting trip in Capri, her hand tightens on her glass. Simon stands apart near the window, holding a teacup he does not drink from. He is watching the portrait, and his expression is that of a man looking at a grave. Evelyn sits in a chair near the door, her tea untouched, her hands folded in her lap. That she is the only person in the room who is not performing for anyone, and Poirot finds this both restful and suspicious. Nicholas moves through the room like a shark through shallow water, restless, watchful, occasionally charming. He compliments Marguerite's dress, flirts mildly with Celeste, asks Dimitri about the art market in a tone that suggests he knows more than he is pretending to know. He ignores Simon entirely, and every few minutes his gaze returns to the portrait. The conversation is light, expensive, full of references to places and people that exist only in the imagination of the very rich. Weekends in Venice, dinners in Paris, a mutual acquaintance who has just purchased a castle in Scotland and is discovering that castles require more than enthusiasm to maintain. But beneath the brightness, Poirot detects the hum of tension, like a wire pulled too tight. It is Dimitri who breaks the surface. "Marguerite," he says, setting down his cup with a deliberate clink. "Shall we speak of the obvious? The portrait has become valuable in a new way. Notoriety is a form of currency. If the story were to reach the press, a Sargent portrait, mysteriously bleeding, owned by one of London's great beauties, the painting's value could double, perhaps more. I have no intention," Lady Marguerite says coldly, "of turning a personal matter into a public spectacle." "Of course not," Dimitri agrees smoothly. "But others might not share your discretion, and the art world is not known for its restraint. If the painting were to come to auction with the right story attached..." "It is not coming to auction." "Not yet," Nicholas interjects cheerfully. "But the future is unpredictable, isn't it? People change their minds. Circumstances change. Maybe you'll wake up one morning and decide you'd rather have £200,000 than a canvas full of mysterious blood." "An appalling suggestion," Simon says quietly from the window. "Is it?" Nicholas turns to him with a grin. "Come on, Simon. You of all people understand the value of liquidity. You've been trying to liquidate the family estate for 3 years. How's that going, by the way?" Simon's face tightens, but he does not respond. "Nicholas," Celeste says softly, and there is a warning in her voice. "What? I'm just making conversation." "You are making discomfort," Poirot says, and his voice is mild but unmistakable. "And in a room such as this, with a mystery such as this, our discomfort is a form of evidence." The room goes quiet. Poirot rises, crosses to the portrait, and stands before it once more. The painted eyes of Lady Marguerite gaze at him, serene and knowing, while the painted blood spreads across her chest like a secret revealing itself. "Mesdames et messieurs," he says quietly, "you are each of you hiding something. This is not unusual. All people hide. But in this room, with this portrait bleeding before us, the hiding has become dangerous. Someone here knows why this painting weeps. Someone here has caused it, and someone here is afraid of what it will reveal." He turns to face them, his hands clasped behind his back. "I will discover which is which. But first, I will take another eclair. This one." with the chocolate. Perfection should never be hurried. The silence that follows is broken by Evelyn Cross, who speaks for the first time since the tea was poured. "Monsieur Poirot," she says, and her voice is quiet but clear. "You assume the bleeding is metaphorical, a symbol of guilt, perhaps, or hidden crime. But what if it is simply what it appears to be? A deterioration of the painting itself. Canvas and pigment are not immortal. They decay. Perhaps what we are witnessing is not mystery, but chemistry." "An excellent suggestion, mademoiselle," Poirot replies. "Except that 4 experts have examined the canvas and found no deterioration. The stain is original. It has always been there. And yet, Lady Marguerite, who sat for the portrait, insists it was not. One of these facts is false, and the false fact is the door through which we enter the truth." "Then which is false?" Simon asks. "The expert's conclusion or my stepmother's memory?" "That, Captain Harcourt, is what I am engaged to discover. But I do not discover in drawing rooms over tea, pleasant though this has been. I discover through method, through order, through the application of the little grey cells to facts arranged in their proper sequence." He bows slightly to the room, thanks Lady Marguerite for her hospitality, and departs. Behind him, the drawing room erupts into conversation. Accusations barely veiled as speculation, defences disguised as indifference. But Poirot does not hear them. He is already thinking. The portrait bleeds. The experts say it is original. Lady Marguerite says it is not. And those edges, those curious, inconsistent edges where sharpness meets diffusion, suggest that both parties may be correct, each describing a different truth about the same canvas. Which means the mystery is not a contradiction. It is a palimpsest. Layers of truth, written one atop the other, each partially obscuring what came before. Someone in that room is lying, someone is afraid, and someone knows that the portrait is not merely bleeding, it is accusing. Chapter 2. The Merchant of Beauty. Morning in London arrives with reluctance, as though the city itself requires persuading that a new day is worth the effort. The sky is the colour of tarnished silver, the air damp and uncertain, and the traffic on the embankment moves with the resigned determination of people who have long since stopped expecting the weather to cooperate with their plans. By 9 o'clock, however, Poirot is dressed, breakfasted, and seated in a taxicab bound for Bond Street, where Dmitri Volkov maintains premises that are less office than temple. The gallery occupies 3 floors of a building that might once have housed a duke or a diplomat. The entrance is discreet, a black door with a brass plaque so understated that only those who already know what they are seeking would notice it. Inside, the walls are white, the floors are oak, and the silence is profound. This is not a place where casual browsers are welcome. This is a place where wealth comes to be confirmed in its taste, where paintings hang in pools of carefully directed light like relics in a chapel, and where the prices, when discreetly inquired about, cause a particular tightening around the eyes that art dealers have learned to interpret as the moment of surrender. Poirot is shown into a private viewing room on the 2nd floor by a young woman whose beauty and discretion are clearly part of the establishment's aesthetic rather than incidental to it. The walls here are hung in charcoal linen. A single painting rests on an easel, a landscape by Pissarro, all dappled light and country tranquility, with a discreet card indicating a price that could purchase a house in Kensington. Dmitri enters through a side door. moving with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to making entrances. Monsieur Poirot, I confess I was surprised to receive your note. I had assumed our conversation at Lady Marguerite's would suffice, but I am, of course, delighted to assist. They sit in chairs upholstered in grey velvet. Between them, a low table holds a crystal decanter of water and 2 glasses. Nothing more. The austerity is calculated. Poirot recognizes it immediately as a negotiating tactic. Surround yourself with less so that the art itself seems like more. Create absence to amplify presence. It is the same technique Lady Marguerite employs with her social persona, and Poirot wonders whether Dimitri learned it from her or she from him. I wished, Poirot says, to speak with you away from the complications of Lady Marguerite's drawing room, away from the others. In such a setting, the truth is often more visible. Truth? Dimitri smiles. An ambitious word for a conversation about art. In my profession, truth is negotiable. An interesting philosophy, monsieur, and perhaps a dangerous one. Only for those who confuse truth with value. A painting is worth what someone will pay for it. That is the only truth that matters in my world. Poirot adjusts the angle of his chair by a fraction of an inch, achieving perfect symmetry with the easel. The Sargent portrait of Lady Marguerite. You have offered your professional opinion on it? I have. Authentic. Unquestionably. Sargent's technique, the painting is as genuine as a Sargent can be. And the stain, the blood. Dimitri's expression shifts, not dramatically, but enough for Poirot to notice. A tightening around the mouth, a flicker in the pale eyes that might be caution or might be calculation. That is where authenticity becomes complicated. The stain is painted. It is not an addition, not damage, not deterioration. The pigment is period appropriate. The brushwork, under magnification, matches Sargent's hand. And yet I have examined photographs of the painting from the 1927 exhibition. No stain. The 1935 catalogue makes no mention of any unusual feature. The painting was described as a portrait of Lady Marguerite in blue velvet with diamonds. That is all. The blood is not documented because the blood was not there. Then someone has altered the painting, Poirot suggests. Someone has added the stain with such skill that it appears original. Impossible. Dimitri's tone is flat, definitive, the tone of a man who has built a career on his ability to distinguish the genuine from the false and does not appreciate having that ability questioned. To replicate Sargent's technique requires not just skill, but genius. To age the pigment appropriately, to integrate it seamlessly into the existing canvas. It would require access to period materials, an intimate understanding of Sargent's methods, and weeks of uninterrupted work. The painting has been in Lady Marguerite's possession, in her home, under her observation. When would such work have been done? And by whom? Unless the painting was replaced entire. A forgery substituted for the original. Also impossible. I have examined it personally. It is not a forgery. It is the portrait I authenticated 5 years ago when Lord Harcourt's estate was being valued. The same canvas, the same frame, the same signature. The only difference is the stain, which, according to every scientific test available, was painted by Sargent in 1926 and has been there ever since. A paradox, Poirot murmurs. A lucrative one, Dimitri says quietly, and here Poirot detects the real man beneath the performance, the merchant beneath the aesthete, the calculator beneath the connoisseur. If the painting were to come to market with this mystery attached, it would sell for double its current valuation, possibly more. There are collectors who would pay anything for a Sargent with a ghost story. The art world adores a scandal. And you have suggested this to Lady Marguerite? I have suggested she consider all her options. She is not poor, but she is not as wealthy as she once was. Lord Harcourt left her well provided for, but maintaining a house in Belgravia, a staff, a social position, these things consume money at an alarming rate. The portrait represents liquid capital. If she chose to sell, she has refused. She has not answered, which, in my experience, means she is considering. Poirot rises, moves to the Pissarro on the easel, examines it with the air of a man who appreciates beauty but distrusts it. Then he does something unexpected. He leans close to the landscape, very close, and studies it with the same intensity he applied to Lady Marguerite's portrait. He straightens. This Pissarro, monsieur, it is excellent. The light, the composition, the delicacy of the brushwork. And yet I observe that the signature has been reinforced. The P in Pissarro is slightly heavier than the remaining letters. And the provenance card mentions a private collection in Switzerland, which is the art world's equivalent of saying a diamond was purchased from a reputable gentleman whose name one cannot quite recall. Dmitri goes very still. What are you suggesting? I suggest nothing. I merely observe that in a gallery where truth is negotiable, even the paintings on the easels may be part of the negotiation. You are a man who understands that authenticity is not merely a scientific fact, but a story one tells about an object. The right story told with sufficient confidence can transform a questionable provenance into an unimpeachable one, and a painting that bleeds. What a story that would be. You are accusing me. I am observing that you have both the knowledge and the motive to transform Lady Marguerite's portrait into something more valuable. You have access to her home. You have expertise in authentication. You have connections throughout the art world. If anyone could orchestrate such a transformation, making a subtle stain dramatic, a quiet painting sensational, it would be you. And yet, as I have explained, the stain is original. Every test confirms it. Then perhaps the tests are examining the wrong thing. They confirm the pigment is period appropriate. They confirm the varnish is uniform. But they do not consider that original materials can be manipulated, that a stain painted subtly might be made to appear more dramatic through chemistry rather than through additional paint. In a world where truth is negotiable, monsieur, how much is a controlled chemical reaction worth? Dmitri stands abruptly, and for the first time his composure cracks visibly. I think our conversation is finished. Au contraire, it has only begun. Poirot moves toward the door, pauses. One final question, if you permit. The night the stain became dramatically visible, 3 weeks ago, where were you? At a dinner party in Mayfair, 20 guests, all of whom can confirm my presence. How convenient. Alibis that are too perfect, monsieur. I are often more suspicious than no alibi at all. Good day. He descends the stairs and emerges onto Bond Street, where the morning sun has finally decided to commit to the day. He walks slowly, thinking. Dmitri Volkov is performing a role, and the performance is nearly flawless. But Poirot has caught him in the Pissarro, that small moment of vulnerability when the dealer's mask slipped and the dealer himself was revealed. A man who reinforces signatures and tells stories about Swiss provenance is a man who understands that reality is malleable. Such a man, confronted with a painting that has begun to change on its own, would not merely observe the phenomenon, he would seek to profit from it. But seeking to profit is not the same as causing. Dmitri may be an opportunist, but is he an architect? That remains to be seen. Poirot's next destination is less elegant but no less revealing. A conservation laboratory in Bloomsbury, housed in a Georgian townhouse that has been converted into a workspace of clinical precision. Here, paintings are not admired but dissected, examined under microscopes and ultraviolet light, subjected to chemical analysis and X-ray photography. Here, beauty is reduced to pigment and canvas and the secrets hidden beneath. Dr. Helena Marsh receives Poirot in a room that smells of turpentine and science. She is perhaps 60, with grey hair cropped short and spectacles that magnify her eyes to an unsettling degree. Her hands are stained with chemicals, her manner is brusque, and her intelligence is immediately and formidably apparent. "You're here about the Harcourt Sargent," she says without preamble. I examined it 3 weeks ago. My report was unequivocal." "And your conclusion?" "The stain is original, painted by Sargent using pigments consistent with his 1926 palette. The brushwork matches his hand in every particular. The varnish layer is uniform, suggesting the entire surface, including the stain, was completed at the same time and varnished together. There is no evidence of later addition, no discontinuity in the craquelure pattern, no difference in aging between the stain and the surrounding paint. By every scientific measure available to me, that blood has been on that canvas for 28 years. She removes her spectacles, polishes them on her laboratory coat, replaces them. Her magnified eyes fix on Poirot with the intensity of a woman who does not appreciate having her conclusions questioned. "And yet," Poirot says mildly, "Lady Marguerite insists the stain was not present when the portrait was painted. She sat for Sargent. She observed every brushstroke." "Human memory is unreliable, Monsieur Poirot, particularly memory across decades. Perhaps she has forgotten. Perhaps she chose not to see. Perhaps Sargent added the detail at the final sitting, when she was tired or distracted. Could the varnish have been removed and reapplied? The painting altered and then re-varnished to conceal the alteration? Theoretically, yes. But the process would require expert skill and would leave traces. I found no such traces." "But you would find them only if you were looking for them specifically?" A pause. The sort of pause a scientist produces when a hypothesis they had not considered is presented with uncomfortable plausibility. Or perhaps... "Then I would ask a favour, Dr. Marsh. Would you consent to re-examine the portrait using raking light, extreme angles, focused specifically on the boundary between the stain and the surrounding paint? I have observed something at those boundaries that troubles me. A variation in edge quality. Some edges are diffuse, as one expects from gradual chemical change, but others are curiously sharp, as though produced by a different process entirely. Two kinds of edges on a single stain suggests two kinds of cause." Dr. Marsh is silent for a moment. Then she does something that surprises Poirot. She smiles. It is a thin smile, but it is genuine, the smile of a scientist whose curiosity has been engaged despite her certainty. "You're suggesting the stain has a dual origin, one component original and one added?" "I suggest nothing yet. I merely observe inconsistency and ask that it be investigated by someone whose instruments are more precise than my spectacles. I will arrange a re-examination, but I want to be present when you view the results. If there is something I missed, I want to understand why I missed it. That, madame, is the most scientific thing you have said this morning. I will look forward to your findings. The afternoon finds Poirot in circumstances that are both more comfortable and more uncomfortable. The Criterion restaurant in Piccadilly, where he has arranged to meet Captain Simon Harcourt for luncheon. The restaurant is all gilt and mirrors, a relic of Victorian confidence now serving the modern world with a certain defensive elegance, higher as though it knows its glory days have passed, but refuses to acknowledge the fact with anything less than impeccable service and unreasonable prices. Poirot arrives precisely on time. Simon arrives 5 minutes late, apologetic and harried, wearing the expression of a man who has been engaged in unpleasant business and has not yet had time to arrange his face into more socially acceptable configurations. Forgive me, Monsieur Poirot. A meeting at the bank ran long. Creditors are so damnably punctual about their demands and so flexible about their understanding. They order sole for Poirot, lamb for Simon, wine for both, and settle into the particular intimacy that restaurants impose on their patrons. Around them, the luncheon crowd hums with conversation. Businessmen negotiating over Dover sole, our ladies discussing charity galas over consommé. The noise provides privacy. You wish to speak with me, Simon says. Away from Belgravia and my stepmother's drawing room, I assume you have questions I cannot answer comfortably in her presence. You are perceptive, Captain. I am tired, Monsieur Poirot. Tired of pretending. Tired of performing the role of dutiful stepson to a woman who tolerates me because convention requires it. We are not a family. We are a business arrangement with blood relations as footnotes. The wine arrives. Poirot waits until the waiter has departed. The portrait. You mentioned yesterday that your stepmother's claim to it was based on a letter from your late father. A letter I have never seen, Simon says, and there is bitterness in his voice now, undisguised. Produced by her solicitor 3 months after my father's death. Convenient timing. The estate had already been catalogued. The division agreed. And then, suddenly, a letter emerges specifying that the Sargent, the single most valuable item in the collection, belongs to Marguerite personally, as a gift, a token of his love. You believe the letter was forged? I believe my father was a man of method and documentation. If he had intended to give Marguerite a painting worth £200,000, he would have done so through proper legal channels, with witnesses and deeds and all the apparatus his lawyers would have insisted upon. A private letter hidden in a desk drawer? It's absurd. But I couldn't prove it was false, and my solicitors advised against contesting it. So I accepted. And now the painting bleeds. Simon's expression darkens. Yes, now the painting bleeds. And I confess, Monsieur Poirot, there is a part of me, a small, mean part I am not proud of, that is glad. Because whatever is happening to that portrait, it disturbs her, and she deserves to be disturbed. Strong words, Captain. Earned words. Simon drinks deeply from his wineglass. My father married Marguerite when he was 63 and she was 32. A beautiful woman, charming, cultured, exactly the sort of ornament a wealthy man acquires to demonstrate he is still vital. I do not judge him for it. He had been a widower for 5 years. He was lonely. She made him happy. But she was not interested in him. She was interested in what he could provide. You accuse her of coldness. I accuse her of clarity. And she knew what she wanted and obtained it. She gave him companionship, beauty, the appearance of a marriage. In return, she received wealth and the protection of his name. When he died, she inherited enough to maintain her position indefinitely. And yet she has not sold the portrait, despite its increased value. Because the portrait is the last evidence of what she was. Selling it would be admitting that beauty is a depreciating asset. As long as the Sargent hangs in her drawing room, she can pretend she is still the woman he painted. Poirot considers him across the white tablecloth. This man whose resentment has had years to calcify into something both hard and brittle. "Did you cause the portrait to bleed, Captain Harcourt?" Simon meets his gaze without flinching. "No, monsieur, I did not. I lack the skill, the access, and the imagination. But I cannot say I am sorry it happened. Does that make me a suspect?" "It makes you honest. And honesty, Captain, is sometimes more revealing than lies. Lies require effort. Honesty suggests one has nothing to fear. Or nothing left to lose." They finish their meal speaking of inconsequential things. The quality of the lamb, the decline of the restaurant trade. But as they part on the pavement outside, Simon says something that catches in Poirot's mind like a burr on cloth. "Monsieur Poirot, whatever you discover, I hope you will consider the possibility that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some secrets once revealed cause more damage than their concealment ever did. My father understood that. He spent his life managing secrets. Perhaps this portrait is trying to tell us something we would be wiser not to hear." "Secrets that speak," Poirot says quietly, "always have a reason for breaking their silence, and that reason is never benign. Au revoir, Captain Harcourt." His final appointment of the day is with Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton of Pemberton and Crow, solicitors, in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Here, in rooms that smell of old paper and older money, he meets with a man of 70 who receives Poirot with a courtesy a solicitor reserves for anyone who might conceivably require his services in future. "Lord Harcourt left a sealed letter," Pemberton says, opening a file with the care of a priest handling scripture. "To be opened only after his death." It specified the portrait was to go to Lady Marguerite. He wrote, "The painting is hers. It was always hers. I let no one contest this." Signed, dated, witnessed by 2 clerks in this office. Unambiguous. And yet one might wonder if Lord Harcourt knew something about that painting, something he wished to remain with his widow, something dangerous. Pemberton closes the file with a snap. "Wondering is not evidence, monsieur. One small detail, Lord Harcourt's death. It was sudden. He was 78. His heart failed, not unexpected, but convenient." Pemberton rises, his face rigid. "I will not entertain speculation about my late client's death." "Forgive me, monsieur. Possibilities, like portraits, sometimes bleed truth when pressed. Good day." He departs, leaving Pemberton among the files of the dead. 4 conversations, 4 versions of truth. And beneath them all, the persistent question: why does a portrait painted in 1926 suddenly begin to bleed in 1954? Poirot walks slowly back to Whitehaven Mansions, his stick tapping a precise rhythm, his mind working. By the time he arrives, he has reached one conclusion. The portrait is not bleeding randomly. The portrait is confessing. And confessions are made not when guilt becomes unbearable, but when someone decides that silence is no longer safe. something has changed. Some new pressure has made 28 years of silence suddenly untenable. The question is not only who made the portrait bleed, but who decided it was time. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Remembers. The morning brings rain, not the dramatic downpour that novels favour, but the steady, undispiriting drizzle that London produces with the reliability of a factory manufacturing melancholy. Poirot observes it from his window while consuming his breakfast egg with the ritualistic precision that begins each day. The egg is perfect, precisely 4 minutes. The shell removed in a single clean operation that George has spent years perfecting. The rain is not perfect. It falls without rhythm, without pattern, without the symmetry that Poirot requires of the universe. He finds this philosophically troubling and says so to George, who responds with the diplomatic silence of a man who has learned that his employer's metaphysical complaints are best addressed with fresh toast rather than philosophy. At 10 o'clock, Miss Evelyn Cross arrives at Whitehaven Mansions carrying an umbrella that has seen better decades and wearing a mackintosh of truly heroic ugliness. She is shown into Poirot's sitting room, where she refuses tea, refuses a chair, and stands near the window with the rigid posture of someone who has learned not to take up too much space in rooms where she does not quite belong. "You asked to see me, Monsieur Poirot. I confess I cannot imagine why. I am hardly central to the mystery of Lady Marguerite's portrait. I am merely the person who files the charitable donations and answers the letters that no one else wishes to answer." "On the contrary, mademoiselle," Poirot says, gesturing to a chair with such authority that she finally sits. "You are perhaps the most important person in this entire affair. You are the one who remembers." "Remembers what?" "Everything. You were Lord Harcourt's personal secretary for 15 years. You managed his correspondence, his appointments, his private papers. You observed his marriage to Lady Marguerite from its beginning. You know things that others have forgotten or chosen not to see. In a house full of beauty and performance, you were the one who kept the accounts. And accountants, mademoiselle, always know where the bodies are buried." Evelyn's expression does not change, but her hands tighten in her lap, a small betrayal that Poirot notes with the attention he gives to all involuntary gestures, which are more reliable than any words ever spoken. "You have a vivid imagination, monsieur. I have experience. And experience tells me that secretaries are the invisible archivists of their employers' lives. You know when Lord Harcourt commissioned the portrait. You probably handled the correspondence arranging the sittings. You were present when the portrait was completed. Am I correct?" A pause. Then, "Yes, I arranged everything. The studio in Paris was booked for 3 weeks in May 1926. Lady Marguerite travelled there with a maid and a wardrobe that required 2 steamer trunks. Lord Harcourt remained in London but visited for the final sitting. I accompanied him. I was present when the portrait was completed." "And was there blood upon the canvas?" "No." The word is absolute, delivered with the certainty of someone who has built a career on precision and does not permit herself the luxury of ambiguity. The portrait showed Lady Marguerite in blue velvet with diamonds at her throat. It was exquisite, perfect. Sargent was particularly pleased with the eyes. He said he had captured not just their colour, but their intelligence. Lord Harcourt was delighted. He paid immediately. There was no stain, no blood. I would have noticed. I notice everything. And yet, there are things you notice that you have not shared. Evelyn rises, moves to the window, stares out at the rain. When she speaks again, her voice is quieter, more strained, as though the words are being extracted from somewhere deep and well defended. There are things about that portrait, Monsieur Poirot, that have troubled me for 28 years. Small inconsistencies that I noticed at the time but dismissed as unimportant. Lord Harcourt was a man of method, as I have said. He documented everything. And yet, there is no formal receipt for the Sargent commission in his financial records. The payment was made in cash, which was unusual for him. He preferred bank drafts, cheques, instruments that left a paper trail. But the Sargent, £50,000, an enormous sum, was paid in cash. 50,000! Poirot's eyebrows rise. That is far more than Sargent's usual commission. I know. I queried it at the time. Lord Harcourt told me the additional expense was for Sargent's discretion. I did not understand what he meant. I assumed it was some peculiarity of commissioning a society portrait. Perhaps Sargent charged more for speed, or for exclusivity, or for whatever intangible quality distinguishes a £50,000 portrait from a £5,000 one. But the word discretion troubled me. Our Lord Harcourt used it deliberately. He was not a man who chose words carelessly. And Lady Marguerite, after the sittings? Different. Evelyn turns from the window, and Poirot sees in her face the marks of someone who has been carrying an observation for decades and is relieved to finally set it down. She had been gay, vivacious, full of energy when she first married Lord Harcourt. She was young and beautiful, and delighted with her new life, the house, the position, the freedom that money provides. She laughed often. She was spontaneous. After the sittings in Paris, she became more controlled, more watchful, as though she were always conscious of being observed and had decided to reveal nothing that was not carefully curated. The spontaneity was gone, and it never returned. You are suggesting that something happened during those sittings, something that changed her. I am suggesting that the portrait knows something we do not, and that it is trying to tell us. Poirot considers this in silence. Then, and Lord Harcourt's death. You were still in his employ. I was with him at the villa in Nice. I managed his correspondence even on holiday. I was there when he collapsed. Evelyn's voice is careful now, measured, as though she is walking along the edge of something and does not wish to fall. He was 78. His heart was weak. The doctors had told him to reduce his activities to avoid strain. He did not listen. He never listened. He was a man who believed that will could overcome physiology. And Lady Marguerite, during this holiday? She was attentive, encouraging. She planned activities, swimming, long walks along the coast, evenings at restaurants where the food was rich and the wine was plentiful. She wanted him to enjoy himself. Or so it appeared. You say, appeared. You doubt her motives? Evelyn meets his gaze directly. I doubt everything about Lady Marguerite, Monsieur Poirot. She is a woman who has made an art of performance. Whether her encouragement was genuine concern for his happiness or something more calculated, I cannot say with certainty. But I know this. Lord Harcourt was over-exerting himself, activities that his physician had explicitly warned against, and Lady Marguerite encouraged every one of them. The words hang in the air between them, heavy with implication. That is a serious observation, mademoiselle. It is an observation. I leave the interpretation to you. She pauses, then adds, almost reluctantly, there is one more thing. In the weeks before the trip to Nice, Lord Harcourt's digitalis prescription was not refilled on schedule. I noticed because I managed his appointments, including his medical ones. The renewal was due, and I mentioned it to Lady Marguerite, who said she would handle it. I assumed she did. But after his death, when I was sorting his effects, I found the medicine bottle. It was nearly empty. It should have been full. You did not mention this to anyone. To whom? The inquest concluded natural causes. His physician confirmed the heart failure was consistent with his condition. And She stops. I was a secretary, Monsieur Poirot. Not a detective, not a physician, not a wife. I had no standing to raise questions, and no evidence to support them, even if I had. Only observations. Only the uncomfortable feeling that things were not quite as they should have been. After Evelyn departs, Poirot sits in silence for some time, his mind arranging pieces that are beginning to form a pattern far darker than a bleeding portrait. A commission paid in cash for discretion. A woman whose personality changed permanently after Paris. A sealed letter ensuring the portrait would remain in her possession. A husband's death under circumstances that were natural and expected and convenient. An unfilled prescription. And now, 28 years later, blood spreading across a canvas, as though the painting itself has decided to bear witness. These facts arrange themselves in Poirot's mind not as a mystery about art, but as the architecture of something far more serious. A woman is not changed by a brief affair alone. Affairs are common, their guilt manageable, their consequences negotiable. What changes a woman permanently, what replaces spontaneity with constant vigilance, is the weight of something irrevocable. Something that cannot be undone or forgotten, but only managed day after day, year after year, until it becomes indistinguishable from the person carrying it. The portrait does not bleed for a love affair. It bleeds for something worse. And someone has decided it is time for that something to become visible. The afternoon finds Poirot in a gentleman's club in St. James's, where Nicholas Carey has agreed to meet him for drinks. Then the club is one of those institutions that London produces with depressing regularity. All dark wood and leather chairs, and the smell of cigars and privilege. Poirot, whose foreignness is tolerated here only because his reputation precedes him, is shown to a corner table where Nicholas is already waiting with a whisky that appears not to be his first. Monsieur Poirot, Nicholas says, rising with the aggressive friendliness of Americans abroad. Good of you to come. I figured you'd want to talk to me without Celeste around. She has a way of making conversations go in directions I'd rather avoid. They sit. Poirot orders a cognac he does not intend to drink. Nicholas drains his whisky and signals for another. You wish to avoid your ex-wife, Poirot observes. And yet, you appeared uninvited at Lady Marguerite's gathering yesterday. One might think you enjoy encounters you claim to avoid. Nicholas grins. Caught me. Yeah, I wanted to see Celeste. Sue me. We were married for 18 months, and I've spent 2 years trying to figure out why it went wrong. Turns out the answer is everything, but I'm an optimist. I keep thinking if I see her enough times, one of us will figure out how to fix it. Tell me about your finances, Monsieur Carey. The grin vanishes with the speed of a light being extinguished. Who the hell have you been talking to? I talk to everyone, monsieur. It is my profession. And everyone tells me things they do not realize they are telling. You came to London 6 years ago with money earned in Chicago. Real estate speculation, I believe. You married Celeste when you were still flush with success. You divorced her when the money began to disappear. And now you orbit Lady Marguerite's circle like a moth around a flame, hoping perhaps that proximity to wealth will restore what you have lost. Am I incorrect? You're not incorrect. You're just an asshole. Nicholas's accent thickens with anger. Yeah, I've had some bad luck. Yeah, I've made some bad investments. That doesn't make me a criminal. And it sure as hell doesn't mean I had anything to do with Maggie's bleeding portrait. And yet the portrait is worth £200,000. Perhaps £400,000 if sold with its mystery attached. I don't own the portrait. Maggie does. But you have connections. You discussed the art market with Monsieur Volkov at the tea party with the knowledge of a colleague, not a stranger. Nicholas goes very still. Oh, we've done business together. I introduced him to some American clients, guys with money who wanted European art. Dimitri got the sales. I got a finder's fee. It was legitimate. And did Monsieur Volkov ever mention the Sargent portrait to you? A hesitation, a fraction of a second too long. Maybe in passing. He said if Maggie ever wanted to sell, he could arrange it. And you mentioned this to Mademoiselle Celeste. I might have. Can't remember. You cannot remember, or you prefer not to say? There is a difference, monsieur, and the difference is called guilt. Nicholas sets down his glass very carefully, and for the first time in their conversation, the performance drops. The charm, the bravado, the aggressive American confidence. All of it falls away, and what remains is a man who is tired and frightened and trying very hard not to show it. You want to know the truth, Poirot, the real truth. I'm broke, not I need to economize broke. Actually broke. I owe money to people who don't send polite letters when you miss a payment. I've been living on charm and credit for 2 years, and both are running out. Celeste was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I destroyed it because I was too proud to admit I was failing. I pushed her away because I couldn't stand her seeing me become something less than what I was when she married me. He drains his fresh whiskey in a single swallow. So, yeah, when Dimitri mentioned the portrait, I thought about it. I thought, if I could somehow be useful, if I could help facilitate a sale, maybe I could get a cut. Maybe I could get enough to pay off the worst of the debts. Maybe I could get back on my feet and show Celeste I was worth another chance. It wasn't a scheme, Poirot. It was desperation dressed up as an idea. And did you act on this idea? No, because I realized I'd have to manipulate Celeste to manipulate Maggie. And I'm not that guy. I'm a lot of things. A failure, a drunk, probably a fool. But I'm not the kind of man who uses someone he loves as a tool. So I dropped it. I came to the tea party because I wanted to see Celeste, not because I had some grand plan. I'm just a guy standing in someone else's drawing room, wishing he still had a seat at the table. Poirot regards him for a long moment. The vulnerability is genuine. He is certain of that. Nicholas Carey is a desperate man. But his desperation has limits that speak well of something buried beneath the bravado. He is not the architect of this mystery. He is, at most, a witness to other people's designs. Thank you for your honesty, Monsieur Carey. It is more valuable than you realize. Yeah, well, honesty's about the only thing I've got left that isn't in hock. Nicholas throws money on the table. Less than before, Poirot notes, as though the confession has relieved him of the need to perform wealth he does not possess. And departs. Poirot sits alone, sipping the cognac he had not intended to drink, but which now seems appropriate. His mind turns to the detail that has been nagging at him since the tea party, the detail he has been circling like a cat around a closed door. The name Duval. Celeste Duval. A French surname. A beautiful young woman who appeared in Lady Marguerite's circle with apparent spontaneity, but with a timing that coincides rather precisely with the portrait's transformation. A woman who studies the painted blood with the familiarity of someone who has been expecting it. A woman whose hand hovered over the canvas with the practiced distance of someone who knows exactly what lies beneath the surface. Poirot does not believe in coincidences. He believes in patterns. He rises, leaves the club, and directs his taxicab not to Whitehaven Mansions, but to a small records office near Somerset House, where births, marriages, and deaths are documented with a remorseless bureaucratic precision that makes England simultaneously tedious and invaluable to detectives. The rain has stopped. The afternoon light is grey and flat, or the light of a city that has been built for documentation rather than beauty. Within the hour he has found what he is looking for. A marriage record from Lyon, France, 1932. James Duval, artist, to Marie-Claire Beaumont, and a birth record from the same city, 1935. Celeste Marie Duval, daughter of James and Marie-Claire Duval. James Duval, an artist, in Paris in the 1920s. Duval, the same surname as the beautiful model who has inserted herself into Lady Marguerite's life. Poirot sits in the records office, surrounded by the dust of other people's histories, and feels the familiar electric certainty that comes when scattered facts suddenly arrange themselves into a pattern. But he does not yet know what James Duval's connection to the portrait is. He knows only that the connection exists, that the name is too specific, in the timing too precise, the surname too rare to be coincidence. He needs more. He needs someone who was in Paris in 1926, in Sargent's studio, who can tell him what James Duval was to Lady Marguerite and to the portrait. And he knows exactly where to find such a person. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Deception. The British Museum reading room is a temple to knowledge, its great dome arching overhead like the skull of some vast and benevolent deity that has decided to house its thoughts in leather and paper rather than in flesh. Poirot sits at one of the long tables surrounded by volumes that smell of time and scholarship, and contemplates a problem that is beginning to acquire the weight and complexity of a cathedral. Beautiful from a distance, but, upon closer examination, comprised of thousands of precisely fitted stones, each one necessary, each one bearing the weight of the stones above. Before him, exhibition catalogues from 1927 and 1935, borrowed from the museum's archives after a brief and productive conversation with the curator that involved references to Inspector Japp and the necessity of absolute discretion. The 1927 catalogue from the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition includes a full-page photograph of Lady Marguerite's portrait. The 1935 catalogue from a private showing at Lord Harcourt's gallery includes a smaller reproduction. Poirot examines both with a magnifying glass of exceptional quality, moving the lens slowly across the printed images as though searching for something that should not exist. And finds it. In the 1927 photograph, taken 1 year after the portrait's completion, the stain is invisible. Lady Marguerite sits in painted perfection, her blue velvet gown unmarred, her expression serene. The photograph is sharp, detailed, professionally executed. If the subtle shadow Sargent painted was present, the camera did not capture it. But in the 1935 photograph, 8 years later, something has changed. The image is smaller, the reproduction less detailed, but Poirot sees what others might miss. A darkness on the bodice of the gown. Faint, easily dismissed as a shadow or a flaw in the printing, but present. The stain has become visible, not dramatically, not in the hemorrhaging manner of its current appearance, but unmistakably there. Poirot sits back, removes his spectacles, polishes them with meticulous care. His mind arranges facts with the precision of a watchmaker assembling a particularly complicated mechanism. The portrait was painted in 1926. By 1927, the stain was either invisible or too subtle for photography. By 1935, the stain was faintly visible in reproduction. And now, in 1954, the stain has become a wound, impossible to ignore. Not a single alteration, but a progression. Not vandalism, but transformation. An internal revelation that has been accelerating, slowly for decades, then rapidly in recent months. But paint does not develop on its own. Not like this. Unless the materials were specifically chosen to change over time. Pigments that oxidize, that darken with exposure to air and light, that transform gradually from shadow to stain, to wound. And the inconsistent edges he noticed on his first examination, some diffuse, some sharp, suggest that even this intentional chemical process has been helped along by a second, more recent hand. See two processes on a single canvas. Two truths layered one atop the other. Poirot returns the catalogues to the librarian with profuse thanks and emerges into the grey afternoon, with a theory forming like a crystal in solution. Beautiful, symmetrical, and cold. By evening, he is seated in a public house in Bloomsbury, a location he would normally avoid with the fastidiousness of a cat avoiding water, but which serves his current purpose admirably. The establishment is called the Lamb and Flag, and it caters to the kind of clientele that Poirot finds both fascinating and slightly distressing. Students, artists, intellectuals who prefer beer to cognac and argument to agreement. The air smells of hops and tobacco and the particular variety of ambition that has not yet been tempered by experience. He has arranged to meet Thomas Webber, she who was assistant to John Singer Sargent during the final years of the artist's career and who now teaches at the Slade School of Fine Art. The connection was not difficult to establish. Sargent's former assistants are documented in the scholarly literature, and Webber is the only one still living in London. Webber arrives promptly at 7 o'clock, a man of perhaps 65 with the stooped posture of someone who has spent decades bending over canvases. His hands are stained with paint that no amount of turpentine will fully remove, and his eyes have the particular clarity of people who have trained themselves to see not what is there, but what is trying to reveal itself. Monsieur Poirot, he says, settling onto the bench opposite with a pint of bitter that suggests this is not his first visit to this establishment. Your message was intriguing. You wish to discuss the Harcourt portrait. I assume this concerns the rather theatrical bleeding that has apparently begun manifesting itself? You have heard of this? The art world is smaller than it appears, monsieur. Rumours circulate. Within our little ecosystem, the bleeding portrait is quite famous. Or infamous, depending on one's perspective. You were present when the portrait was painted. I was. I prepared Sargent's canvases, mixed some of his colours, cleaned his brushes. the tedious work that allows genius to function. I was 23 years old and considered it the greatest privilege of my life to be in his studio. And the Harcourt portrait. You remember it? Weber drinks deeply from his pint, his eyes going distant with memory. I remember everything about it. Sargent was not pleased with the commission. He had stopped accepting society portraits years earlier. He found them tedious, repetitive, dishonest. But Lord Harcourt offered an extraordinary fee, and Sargent, for all his genius, was not immune to financial inducement. So he accepted. Lady Marguerite came to the studio for 3 weeks in May 1926. She was beautiful, of course. They were all beautiful. But she was also unhappy in a way that interested Sargent. He said she had the face of someone performing happiness rather than experiencing it. He wanted to paint that performance, to capture the mask and hint at what lay beneath. And during those 3 weeks in Paris, was Lady Marguerite always in the studio? Or were there intervals, absences, occasions when she was elsewhere? Weber's glass pauses halfway to his mouth. His eyes sharpen with something that might be caution. She was not always present, no. Sittings were typically 4 or 5 hours. The rest of the day was her own. And she spent it how? I wouldn't know. I was in the studio, preparing materials, cleaning up after the sessions. What Lady Marguerite did with her free time in Paris was her own affair. An interesting choice of word, monsieur. Affair. The silence between them thickens. Weber sets down his glass with care. I have been examining records, Poirot continues, his voice quiet and precise. Birth records, marriage records, the kind of bureaucratic documentation that most people find tedious, but which a detective finds illuminating. I have discovered that in 1932, a man named James Duval married in Lyon. And in 1935, his daughter Celeste was born. James Duval was an artist. He was in Paris in 1926. He frequented the studios of Montparnasse, and his daughter now calls herself a dear friend of Lady Marguerite and has been visiting her drawing room and her portrait regularly for 3 years. Weber's face has gone very still. I believe James Duval had an affair with Lady Marguerite during those sittings. I believe Sargent knew about it. And I believe the £50,000 Lord Harcourt paid for the portrait included a premium for Sargent's silence about what he had witnessed in his own studio. Am I correct, Monsieur Weber? A long pause. Then Weber exhales slowly, like a man setting down a burden he has carried for too long. Yes. James Duval was a young artist, French or half French. His mother was from Lyon. His father English. He was talented but unfocused, high-passionate but undisciplined. He haunted the cafes and studios of Montparnasse, attempting to make a career from inadequate skill and excessive charm. Lady Marguerite met him at a gallery opening. They had an affair that lasted approximately 2 weeks. It ended when Lord Harcourt arrived in Paris. Duval was devastated. He had convinced himself she would leave her husband. When she didn't, he threatened to expose the affair. Sargent paid him £5,000 to leave Paris and never contact Lady Marguerite again. He took the money and disappeared. And Sargent, he painted this knowledge into the portrait? Yes, deliberately. In the final session, after Lady Marguerite had left the studio for the day, Sargent added a stain above her heart, nearly invisible, a shadow in the velvet, a darkening of the blue. I asked him why. He said, because guilt should be visible, Thomas. Not obviously, not in a way that destroys the beauty of the surface, but visible to those who know how to look. This woman is guilty of something. I see it in her eyes, so I'm painting it. Let those who come after decide what it means. And the pigment he used for this stain, it was unusual? Weber nods slowly. Sargent had been experimenting with unstable pigments, mixtures that would change over time, darken, spread, transform as they oxidized. He said he was painting a time bomb, something that would become more visible as the years passed, as though the portrait itself was aging into truth. A pigment that darkens over time, Poirot repeats. A deliberate chemical process designed to reveal what was hidden. Exactly. A mixture of madder lake and ivory black, with a particular varnish that would allow oxidation to continue beneath the surface. I prepared it according to his specifications. I did not understand the chemistry at the time. It was only years later, when I began teaching conservation, that I realized what he had done. And could this process be accelerated by heat, by light, by chemical agents? Yes, any of those would speed the oxidation considerably. In a climate-controlled gallery, the darkening would proceed slowly, perhaps becoming faintly visible after a decade, noticeably present after 2. But in a room with sunlight and a fireplace exposed to temperature fluctuations, the process could accelerate dramatically. As it has done, Poirot says, since Lady Marguerite moved the portrait from her late husband's gallery to her drawing room 6 months ago. And as it has been further accelerated, I believe, by someone who has been deliberately exposing the canvas to concentrated heat during private visits to the drawing room. Weber's expression shifts. You think someone is deliberately making it bleed faster? I am certain of it, and I believe that someone is Celeste Duval, James Duval's daughter, who has spent 3 years cultivating Lady Marguerite's friendship for precisely this purpose. Weber absorbs this in silence. His painter's hands flex unconsciously around his glass. Poirot watches him closely, noting how the information lands, not with surprise exactly, but with something more complicated. Recognition, perhaps, or the discomfort of a man who knows more than he is saying. You did not seem surprised to hear that Celeste Duval is connected to James, Poirot observes quietly. A man who reacts to genuinely unexpected news moves differently than a man who is hearing confirmed what he already suspected. Weber looks up. Their eyes meet, and Poirot sees in the older man's gaze a weariness that goes deeper than age. The weariness of someone who has been keeping a secret that has grown heavier with each passing year. What is your connection to James Duval, Monsieur Weber? And I ask that you do not insult my intelligence with evasion. The truth will emerge. It always does. The only question is whether it emerges gently, in conversation, or violently, in revelation. Weber drains his pint. When he speaks, his voice is rough. James Duval was my son. The words fall between them with the weight of something that has been held too long and released too suddenly. Your son, Poirot repeats softly. My son by a woman I was not married to. A woman I could not marry because I was young and poor and working in another man's studio. I raised the boy when his mother died. He was talented, not as talented as he believed himself to be, but talented enough. He could have had a decent career if he had been patient, but he fell in love with Lady Marguerite, and love destroyed him. She took his passion and his hope, and she discarded him like a failed canvas. He was never the same after Paris. He married badly, drank heavily, died young in 1944, not heroically in the resistance, but miserably in a boarding house in Lyon, drunk and alone. And he left behind a daughter who inherited not just his features, but his bitterness. And you have been in contact with this granddaughter. Weber nods. I found her again 5 years ago. She had become a model in Paris, successful and beautiful. I told her about her father, about the portrait, about Sargent's technique, about the secret it contained. And she decided to make the portrait bleed. She decided that justice required visibility. She moved to London, cultivated Lady Marguerite's friendship. And when the portrait was moved to the drawing room, she began accelerating the oxidation. Poirot is silent for a moment, arranging the new information against the pattern he has been building. Celeste's motivation is now clear, a daughter's revenge for a father's destruction. But the edges on the canvas still trouble him. Those sharp edges that suggest not merely accelerated chemistry, but actual brushwork. Celeste is a model, not a painter. She would know how to expose canvas to heat. She would not know how to apply paint in a way that replicates Sargent's technique. He files this observation away. There will be time to pursue it later. First, he needs to understand the larger architecture of the case before he addresses its finer details. Thank you, Monsieur Weber. Your memory has been invaluable. I have one more question. The oxidizing pigment mixture. Did you keep the formula? Could you recreate it? I could. The ingredients are not exotic, but why would I? Weber stops himself. Something shifts in his expression. You think someone has been doing more than just accelerating the oxidation, or you think someone has been adding to the canvas. I think the portrait is telling two stories, Poirot says, one old and one new, and I intend to determine which is which. Good evening, Monsieur Weber. He departs into the night, leaving Weber alone with his bitter and his memories, and the dawning recognition that the investigation has moved closer to him than he anticipated. The pattern is nearly complete. Celeste Duval has been accelerating the portrait's oxidation. This much is established, but the sharp edges suggest a second hand, a hand capable of replicating Sargent's brushwork, working with period-appropriate pigments, enhancing the stain in ways that transcend chemistry. And Poirot has just been sitting across from the only person alive who possesses exactly those skills. But that confrontation can wait. First, there is Lady Marguerite, because the portrait does not bleed for an affair. It bleeds for something worse, something that the affair set in motion, something that connects 1926 to 1948, Paris to Nice, a young woman's betrayal to an old man's death. And Lady Marguerite is the only person who can confirm what Poirot has begun to suspect. Tomorrow, he will visit her. Not in the drawing room with its calculated grandeur and its audience of beautiful people. In her private sitting room where the furniture is worn and the books are read, and the performance of Lady Marguerite Harcourt gives way, however briefly, to the woman beneath. Chapter 5. The Confession of Silence. 4. The rain has stopped by the time Poirot arrives at Chester Square, but the sky remains the colour of old pewter, and the air carries that peculiar dampness that makes London feel less like a city and more like an experiment in cultivated melancholy. The wisteria on Lady Marguerite's balcony drips steadily onto the pavement below, each drop striking the stone with the regularity of a clock, counting down to something inevitable. The butler admits him without ceremony, as though Poirot's arrival has been expected or perhaps feared. He is shown not to the drawing room but to a smaller chamber on the ground floor. Lady Marguerite's private sitting room, a space he suspects few visitors are permitted to see. It is beautiful, of course. Everything in this house is beautiful, but it is a different species of beauty than the drawing room's calculated grandeur. Here the furniture is older, more worn, arranged for comfort rather than impression. The books line the walls, actual books, their spines cracked from reading, not decorative sets purchased by the yard. A fire burns in the grate despite the June date, suggesting that Lady Marguerite feels cold in ways that summer cannot remedy. And on a small table beside her chair, a photograph in a silver frame. A young woman, perhaps 20, laughing at something outside the camera's range, caught in a moment of unguarded joy that seems to belong to another century. Lady Marguerite sits beside the fire in a chair upholstered in faded rose silk, wearing a dress of dove grey that makes her look both younger and older than she appeared at the tea party. Without the performance of public presentation, she seems somehow more real and more fragile, like a watercolour left too long in sunlight. The lines around her eyes are visible now, and the set of her mouth suggests not determination, but exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something together for so long that she has forgotten what it felt like before the holding began. "Monsieur Poirot," she says, and does not rise. "You have come to interrogate me at last. I have been waiting." "I do not interrogate, madame. I converse. Interrogation suggests an adversary. I prefer to think of my consultations as collaborations in pursuit of truth." How diplomatic. She studies him with the directness of a woman who has decided that social graces are, for the moment, an unnecessary expense. "I have been watching the pattern of your inquiries. Dimitri, the conservator. Simon, the solicitor. You have been gathering intelligence the way a general surveys a battlefield before committing his troops. It is my move now, I think. So ask your questions. I will answer them. Some of them." Poirot settles into the chair opposite hers, adjusting its position slightly so that they sit in perfect symmetry before the fire. "You knew the portrait would bleed." It is not a question. Lady Marguerite's expression does not change, but something shifts behind her eyes, recognition perhaps, or relief, that the pretense is finally ending. "I suspected it might. Not immediately, but eventually. Sargent told me in his oblique way. He said every portrait tells the truth eventually. I chose to interpret this as artistic philosophy rather than as a literal warning. I realize now it was both." "Then you know what the blood represents." "I know what it accuses me of. Whether that accusation is the whole truth is a more complicated question than you might imagine." Poirot waits. Silence is often the most effective interrogation tool. People fill silence the way water fills a vessel, pouring themselves into the emptiness until they have said more than they intended. Lady Marguerite rises, moves to the window, looks out at the rain-dark square. When she speaks, her voice is quieter, stripped of the social polish that usually armours it. And Poirot hears for the first time the voice of the woman beneath the performance. Younger, more uncertain, carrying the particular weight of someone who has been rehearsing a confession for decades without ever quite finding the courage to deliver it. In 1926, I was 32 years old. I had been married to Lord Harcourt for 6 months, and I was still adjusting to the realities of being a wife to a man old enough to be my grandfather, wealthy enough to buy anything except youth, kind enough to deserve better than what I was giving him. He loved me, Monsieur Poirot, genuinely, not for what I represented or what I could provide, but for myself. It was the first time in my life anyone had loved me that way, and I did not know what to do with it. I had married him for security, for position, for escape from a life of genteel poverty in the provinces. I gave him companionship, beauty, the performance of affection, but I did not give him love. I did not know how. She pauses, her fingers tracing patterns on the window pane. Small, unconscious circles, as though she is writing something in a language only she can read. He commissioned the portrait as a gift. He wanted me immortalized at the height of my beauty. We went to Paris separately, as I preferred to travel with my maid rather than with a husband whose age embarrassed me in public. I am not proud of that. I was vain and young and cruel in the way young people are cruel without realizing the wounds they inflict. You sat for Sargent for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks, I had an affair. With James Duval. Her head turns sharply. You know his name. I have made inquiries, madame. I have discovered that Monsieur Duval was a young artist who frequented the studios of Montparnasse, that you met him at a gallery opening, that the affair lasted approximately 2 weeks, and that it ended when Lord Harcourt arrived in Paris. Sargent knew, Lady Marguerite says, and her voice now carries the flatness of someone who has spent decades compressing an experience into a story that can be told without breaking. He saw everything. He always did. He painted the guilt, not the affair itself, but the knowledge that I was betraying a man who trusted me absolutely. He painted it into the canvas as a stain above my heart. He said, "Every portrait tells the truth eventually, Lady Marguerite. This one will tell yours when the time is right." I demanded he remove it. He refused. He said it was integral to the composition. I threatened to refuse the portrait. He said, "Then tell him why." "And you accepted it." I had no choice. My husband arrived. He saw nothing wrong. The stain was too subtle, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. He was delighted with the portrait. Sargent was paid. The extra expense, the 50,000, far above his usual fee, was for his silence. And James Duval? Sargent paid him to leave Paris, £5,000. He took the money and disappeared. I heard he married, settled in Lyon. I believe he died during the war. Lady Marguerite returns to her chair, sinks into it as though the act of speaking has drained something vital from her. I have carried this for 28 years. The guilt of a woman who betrayed a good man's trust. And now the portrait displays that guilt for anyone to see. Poirot regards her in silence for a long moment. She has delivered this confession with the careful architecture of someone who has rehearsed it. Not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. She has offered the truth she can afford. The truth she cannot afford is something else entirely. Madame, he says gently, an affair conducted 28 years ago, however painful, is not the sort of secret that produces the kind of fear I observe in you. Fear ages a person, and it has aged you, not in beauty, but in vigilance. The woman Evelyn Cross describes before Paris was spontaneous, alive. The woman she describes afterwards was controlled, watchful. A permanent transformation, An affair might produce guilt. It does not produce the kind of fundamental change that replaces a person's entire way of being in the world. Lady Marguerite goes very still. The portrait does not bleed for James Duval, Poirot continues. It bleeds for something that connects not merely to 1926, but to 1948. To a villa in Nice, or to a husband whose heart failed under circumstances that everyone accepted as natural, because no one had reason to question them. The word hangs in the air between them. Lady Marguerite closes her eyes. I will not discuss my husband's death, Monsieur Poirot. Then we need not discuss it today. But I ask you to consider something before we meet again. Before I gather everyone in your drawing room and present what I have discovered. Consider whether you would rather the truth emerge from my lips, gently and with discretion, or from the lips of someone who means you harm. Because it will emerge, madame. The portrait has ensured that. He allows the silence to hold, then shifts direction with the precision of a surgeon changing instruments. Mademoiselle Céleste Duval. You describe her as a dear friend. When did this friendship begin? 3 years ago. She arrived in London from Paris. We met at a gallery opening. Lady Marguerite stops, and Poirot watches understanding dawn in her eyes, terrible and slow. A gallery opening, just as I met her father. Céleste Marie Duval, born in Lyon in 1935, daughter of James Duval and Marie-Claire Beaumont. Your lover's daughter, madame. She has been in your home, beside your portrait, for 3 years. The colour drains from Lady Marguerite's face with a completeness that suggests not merely shock, but the collapse of an entire structure. A wall she has been maintaining for years, suddenly revealed as load-bearing, now crumbling. She knows, Lady Marguerite whispers. About the affair? At minimum, and she's been accelerating the portrait's deterioration, making the stain visible, making it bleed. She's been using knowledge of Sargent's techniques to transform a subtle accusation into a public spectacle. Lady Marguerite rises, moves to the photograph on the table, the laughing girl of 20, and picks it up. She holds it for a moment, studying the face of her younger self, and when she speaks, her voice carries a grief so old it has become indistinguishable from the person containing it. That girl had no idea what her life would become. I envy her ignorance. She is laughing, Poirot observes. She laughed often. I stopped somewhere along the way. One does, I think, when one realizes that beauty is currency, and currency must be managed carefully lest it be spent on the wrong things. I spent mine on security. I have never been certain whether I made a wise investment or a catastrophic error. She replaces the photograph with care. What happens now? Tomorrow, your drawing room, everyone present, I will present what I have discovered, and you, madame, will have the opportunity to decide how much of the truth you wish to claim as your own, and how much you wish to leave for others to interpret. He bows and departs, leaving Lady Marguerite standing alone in her private sitting room, surrounded by beautiful things that suddenly feel less like possessions and more like evidence. And the photograph of the laughing girl seems to watch her with the serene, unknowing cruelty of the past, that country from which no one returns, and which no portrait, however honest, can fully represent. Chapter 6. The Gallery of Lies. Morning arrives with unseasonable clarity, as though London has decided to compensate for yesterday's melancholy with aggressive cheerfulness. Sunlight floods Chester Square with such determination that even the most stoic buildings seem surprised by their own visibility. Poirot, observing this meteorological optimism from the window of a taxicab, considers it an appropriate backdrop for revelation. Truth, like sunshine, is most effective when it arrives unexpectedly and illuminates corners that have grown comfortable with darkness. But before Chester Square, there is one more conversation to conduct. The taxicab deposits Poirot at the Slade School of Fine Art in Bloomsbury shortly after 9 o'clock, where Thomas Webber is preparing for a morning lecture. Or Poirot finds him in a north-facing studio on the 3rd floor, surrounded by half-finished canvases and the smell of linseed oil and turpentine. "Monsieur Webber," Poirot says from the doorway, "I require a moment of your time. A brief moment, but a consequential one." Webber turns. His expression suggests he has been expecting this visit and dreading it. "You've been back to the portrait," Webber says. It is not a question. "I have, and Dr. Marsh has re-examined the stain's boundaries under raking light, as I requested. Her findings are illuminating. The diffuse edges are consistent with oxidized pigment, Sargent's original technique. But the sharp edges are something else. Brush strokes, Monsieur Webber. Fresh brush strokes, applied with extraordinary skill and using pigments that match the original canvas so precisely that only extreme angular illumination reveals them as additions." Webber crosses to the window, stares out at the grey London roofscape. "I wondered if you would find them. When did you begin enhancing the stain?" 6 months ago. Celeste's heat treatments were accelerating the oxidation, but not fast enough. Not dramatically enough. It needed visibility. So I visited Lady Marguerite's home, claiming to conduct research on Sargent's technique. She left me alone with the portrait for hours, and during those hours, I painted, just enough to enhance what was already there. Does Celeste know? No. She believes the bleeding is entirely her doing. I let her believe it. "You will be at Chester Square this morning," Poirot says. It is not a question. I was not invited. "You are invited now, by me, because the truth requires all its participants to be present when it is assembled." Webber is silent for a long moment, then he nods. Lady Marguerite's drawing room has been arranged with care. The chairs form a precise semicircle facing the portrait. They arrive in sequence, like actors entering for the final act. Simon Harcourt comes first, punctual and rigid, wearing a dark suit that suggests he is attending either a business meeting or a funeral, and has not decided which. Dmitri Volkov arrives next, dressed in pale linen. Evelyn Cross enters quietly, carrying her small notebook. Nicholas Carey arrives with defensive joviality. "Well, this is cosy. Are we having a séance?" Celeste Duval is the last of the original guests to arrive. She wears black, a simple sheath dress that manages to be both mourning and celebration. She pauses in the doorway, surveys the room, and takes the remaining chair without speaking. And then, unexpected by everyone except Poirot, Thomas Webber enters. He is dressed in his best suit, which is not very good, and he moves with the uncertain gait of a man who does not belong in rooms like this, and knows it. Celeste sees him and goes very still. Her composure, which has been flawless throughout, cracks for the first time. A flash of something that might be surprise or might be fear, crossing her features before the mask resettles. "Grandfather," she says, and the word detonates quietly in the room. Several heads turn. Lady Marguerite frowns. I asked Monsieur Weber to join us, Poirot explains. His presence is necessary for the complete telling of this story. Weber takes a chair at the edge of the semicircle, his paint-stained hands clasped in his lap, his eyes fixed on the portrait above the mantelpiece. Lady Marguerite stands beside the mantelpiece, beneath the portrait, her position that of a defendant awaiting verdict. She has dressed with particular care. A suit of navy silk, pearls at her throat and ears, her hair arranged in the style Sargent captured 28 years ago. Standing beneath her painted self, she appears both older and ageless, as though time has touched her but not diminished her, only refined her into something more essential. Poirot moves to the centre of the semicircle. He carries nothing. No notes, no files. He requires none. The evidence is in this room. Mesdames et messieurs, he begins, his voice quiet but carrying effortlessly through the silk-hung space. I have asked you here this morning because a mystery demands resolution. Not merely the mystery of a bleeding portrait, though that is dramatic enough, but the deeper mystery beneath. Why does this portrait bleed? What secret is it revealing? And who has decided after 28 years of silence that this secret must be exposed? He pauses, allowing the questions to settle. When I first examined this portrait, I observed a paradox. The stain is original. All scientific analysis confirms this. And yet, Lady Marguerite insists the stain was not present when the painting was completed. Both facts cannot be true unless we accept a third possibility, that both are correct, but they describe different moments in the portrait's history. He turns to address the room. John Singer Sargent used an experimental pigment, a mixture designed to oxidize over time, darkening gradually across decades. He painted a subtle stain above Lady Marguerite's heart, so faint as to be nearly invisible, knowing that it would become more visible as the years passed. He was painting a time bomb, a secret designed to reveal itself slowly, inevitably, like guilt emerging from repression. And what secret? Dmitri asks. Guilt over what? We will come to that. First, the mechanism. For 20 years, the portrait hung in Lord Harcourt's climate-controlled gallery, where the oxidation proceeded slowly. But 6 months ago, Lady Marguerite moved the portrait here. Sunlight, a fireplace, temperature fluctuations. The oxidation accelerated, and someone in this room accelerated it further. The room contracts, as 6 people hold their breath. Dr. Helena Marsh re-examined the portrait at my request and confirmed localized heat damage, concentrated warmth applied to specific areas of the stain, accelerating the oxidation in a controlled pattern. He turns to Celeste. Mademoiselle Celeste, you have visited this drawing room frequently. You have often been left alone. You study the portrait with the familiarity of someone watching it change, not with surprise, but with satisfaction. Celeste's hands tighten in her lap. Your name is Celeste Marie Duval. Born in Lyon in 1935 to James Duval, a young artist who had an affair with Lady Marguerite in Paris in 1926. An affair that Sargent witnessed and painted into the canvas. An affair that ended when your father was paid £5,000 to leave Paris. He spent the rest of his life in Lyon, broken by disappointment. He died in 1944. And he told you before he died about the woman who rejected him and the portrait that carried her secret. He lays it out with precision. The cultivation of Lady Marguerite's friendship, the move to London, The 3 years of careful positioning, the heat treatments applied during private visits. Each fact is placed before the room like a card in a game of patience, each one making the pattern clearer. Celeste does not deny it. When she speaks, her voice is cold and clear. He was 26 years old when she destroyed him. My father. He loved her absolutely. She took his love and paid him to disappear. He spent the rest of his life dying slowly of disappointment. He told me about her before the end. He said, "She was so beautiful, Celeste. So beautiful and so cold. Like a portrait. Not real, never real. Just a beautiful lie." I decided justice required visibility. The room exhales. Simon leans back with grim satisfaction. Dimitri's expression calculates commercial implications. Nicholas looks bewildered, but Poirot does not pause. We are not finished. Every head turns. The room, which had begun to relax, contracts again. Mademoiselle Celeste accelerated the oxidation. This is established, but the oxidation alone does not fully explain what we see. Dr. Marsh's re-examination revealed 2 kinds of edges on the stain. Diffuse edges consistent with oxidized pigment, and sharp edges consistent with fresh brush strokes, applied with extraordinary skill, using pigments that match the original canvas so precisely that expert examination failed to detect them. He turns to Weber. "Monsieur Weber." The old man rises slowly. Celeste stares at him, and Poirot watches understanding and then betrayal cross her face in quick succession. "Thomas Weber was John Singer Sargent's assistant," Poirot says. "He prepared Sargent's canvases, mixed his pigments, learned his technique. He is also the grandfather of Mademoiselle Celeste, the father of James Duval, raised under different circumstances. He has been visiting this house under the pretext of scholarly research, and during those visits he has been painting on the portrait, enhancing the stain, making it more dramatic than either Sargent's oxidation or Celeste's heat treatments could achieve alone." Celeste's composure breaks. "You didn't tell me. I didn't know. I wanted to protect you," Weber says quietly. "If the scheme was discovered, your involvement could be limited to the heat treatments. My additions are more serious. I wanted to bear that risk myself." "2 conspirators," Simon says slowly, "working on the same painting. 3 causes, Captain Harcourt. Sargent's original technique, Mademoiselle Celeste's heat treatments, and Monsieur Weber's brushwork. 3 layers of truth on a single canvas." Poirot allows a silence. It is the silence of an audience that believes the performance is over, the revelation complete, the mystery solved, the curtain about to fall. He lets them sit in that false comfort for precisely 3 seconds. Then he speaks again, and his voice has changed. It is quieter now, more careful, the voice of a man who is about to light a fuse. But the question remains, what truth are all 3 layers revealing? He turns to Lady Marguerite, and the room understands, with a collective intake of breath, that the mystery has not been solved at all. It has only been prepared for. "The portrait does not bleed for a love affair," Poirot says. "An affair conducted 28 years ago, however painful, does not produce the kind of fundamental transformation that multiple witnesses describe in Lady Marguerite after Paris. Miss Cross has told me that Lady Marguerite was spontaneous before the sittings and controlled afterward. That change is not the mark of a woman who had a brief romance. It is the mark of a woman who recognized something in herself during that romance, something that frightened her, something she spent the next 22 years managing. Monsieur Poirot, Lady Marguerite begins. Sargent saw it. Poirot continues gently. He told Monsieur Weber that Lady Marguerite was guilty of something, that he saw it in her eyes, in the way she held herself when she thought no one was watching. He did not know what, but he was right, because the guilt was not for the affair itself. It was for what the affair revealed about her capacity, the capacity to calculate, the capacity to use beauty as a weapon and love as currency, the capacity to look at a kind, trusting husband and think not, I have wronged him, but I am capable of much worse than this. The room is utterly still. Lord Harcourt died in 1948, Poirot says, at a villa in Nice of heart failure. He was 78. It was not unexpected. But the circumstances bear examination. His physician had advised against the trip. His medication, digitalis, was not properly maintained in the weeks preceding it. And the activities Lady Marguerite arranged for him were precisely the sort his doctor had warned would overtax his heart. These are not the actions of a devoted wife. They are the actions of a woman who had spent 22 years managing an unbearable guilt, and who concluded, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps with terrible clarity, that the only escape was the one that nature could be encouraged to provide. Lady Marguerite closes her eyes. The portrait bleeds for Lord Harcourt, Poirot says, for a death that was natural and expected and convenient, for a wife who did not poison or strike, but who shaped circumstances with the same calculation she brought to her marriage, her social position, and her survival. Sargent saw the capacity for this in 1926 and painted it into the canvas. Yet the portrait has been revealing that capacity ever since, slowly, chemically, inevitably, until 3 people decided to make the revelation dramatic enough that it could no longer be ignored. Lady Marguerite opens her eyes. She looks at Poirot, and her expression is that of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that the setting down is more painful than the carrying. I did not murder my husband, she says. Her voice is steady, but only just. I did not administer poison or strike him or do anything a court would call a crime. No, Poirot agrees, but you created conditions. You encouraged exertion. You were careless with medication. You chose a location far from his physicians. And when his heart failed, you expressed grief and inherited everything, including the portrait, which you kept not as a monument to your beauty, but as a form of penance. Because you knew that the blood on the canvas was not merely Sargent's accusation of infidelity. It was a prophecy. The silence that follows is the deepest the room has known. The portrait gazes down at them all, the painted Lady Marguerite serene and knowing, the painted blood spreading across her chest like a confession 28 years in the making. I tell you this, Poirot says, turning to address the room, not to condemn Lady Marguerite, but to explain why the portrait bleeds. Celeste sought to expose an affair. Weber sought to avenge his son. Sargent sought to paint the truth he saw in a woman's eyes. None of them knew the full extent of what they were revealing. The portrait is wiser than any of its creators. Lady Marguerite speaks. Her voice carries the weight of decades. The portrait will remain where it is. Let it bleed. Let it tell its truth. I have spent 28 years hiding. Perhaps it is time to stop. She turns to Celeste. You are no longer welcome in my home. Not because I hate you, but because I cannot bear to look at you and see your father's face and remember what I did to him. That is punishment enough for both of us. Celeste nods once sharply and walks from the room without another word. Weber follows her, pausing only to look back at the portrait one final time. The painting he helped create, helped alter, helped force into honesty. His expression is that of a man who has completed something and is not certain whether it was an act of justice or merely another form of damage. The others depart in silence. Simon with grim satisfaction, Dmitri recalculating, Nicholas with the bewildered respect of someone who has witnessed a depth of human complexity he had not imagined. Evelyn with her notebook clutched to her chest. Only Poirot remains, standing with Lady Marguerite beneath the bleeding portrait. "The question of your husband's death remains unresolved," he says quietly. "What you describe, irregular medication, encouraged exertion, these are circumstances, not crimes. Whether they constitute murder or merely the passive acceptance of natural mortality is a question I cannot answer. Can anyone? Perhaps not. But I would suggest that you ask yourself not whether you are guilty in a legal sense, but whether you believe yourself to be guilty. Because that belief is what Sargent saw and what the portrait has been revealing ever since. Not a crime, a capacity. And the capacity once recognized became the act. Lady Marguerite touches the frame of the portrait gently. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for your discretion and your honesty." "They are the same thing, madame, used correctly." He bows and departs. Chapter 7. The Painted Truth. A week passes in London with the peculiar quality of time that follows significant events. Each day distinct, yet somehow compressed, as though the city itself is catching its breath after exertion. Poirot observes this phenomenon from his window while consuming his morning egg, noting how the squares and crescents of the metropolis continue their routines with the determination of actors who know the performance must go on regardless of what occurred backstage. He has not heard from Lady Marguerite. He does not expect to. Their business is concluded, and she has returned to the management of her beautiful, bleeding conscience. He has, however, received a brief note from Thomas Weber, confirming that he will write the scholarly article on Sargent's oxidizing pigment technique that Poirot has required as the price of his discretion. The note is written on Slade School stationery, and its tone suggests a man who has found unexpected relief in the prospect of contributing to knowledge rather than merely to vengeance. "You were right," Weber writes. "It should have been a paper, not a plot. I see that now." On the 8th morning, a letter arrives. The envelope is expensive, cream-laid paper with a Park Lane address embossed discreetly at the top. Inside, a note written in the precise, elegant hand of someone who was trained in penmanship when such things still mattered. "Monsieur Poirot, I wonder if you might spare an hour this afternoon for a matter that is not precisely a mystery, but which requires, I believe, the particular clarity you bring to complicated situations. I would come to you, but my mobility is not what it was, and I confess I would prefer to speak in my own territory, where I am not quite so conscious of my limitations. Yours with respect, Evelyn Cross curiosity compels him to accept." By 3 o'clock, he is seated in a modest but impeccably maintained flat overlooking Hyde Park, where Evelyn Cross receives him with the nervous hospitality of someone who does not often entertain. The flat is revealing. Books everywhere, not for decoration but for use, their spines cracked, their margins annotated. A desk by the window covered with correspondence and files related to the Harcourt Foundation. Photographs on the walls. Lord Harcourt at various stages of his life. always at the center of groups, always authoritative, the face of a man who expected the world to arrange itself according to his preferences and was rarely disappointed. And in a small silver frame on the mantelpiece, a photograph Poirot recognizes. Lady Marguerite at 20, laughing, unguarded. The same photograph that stands in Lady Marguerite's private sitting room. Evelyn notices his observation. Lord Harcourt had copies made when he first met her. He gave one to me when I commented on how lovely she looked. He said, "Beauty like this should be documented while it exists. It is a historical artifact, like a perfect Greek vase." He always spoke that way, as though people were objects to be catalogued and preserved. It was not meant unkindly. He simply thought in terms of collections. They sit. Tea is poured, properly, with care, but without the theatrical grandeur of Lady Marguerite's Sèvres service. Plain white china, a pot from Fortnum's, milk in a jug. The tea of a woman who values precision without requiring performance. And Evelyn Cross, after a moment of visible gathering of courage, begins. "I lied to you, Monsieur Poirot. Not dramatically. Not about anything that affects the resolution of the bleeding portrait. But I lied nonetheless, and the lie has been troubling me. I am not accustomed to dishonesty. My entire professional life has been built on accuracy, on documentation, on recording things exactly as they are, rather than as people wish them to be. And yet, I lied to you about something fundamental, and I find I cannot bear it any longer." Poirot sets down his teacup with care. "I am listening, mademoiselle. I told you I was Lord Harcourt's secretary for 15 years. That was true. I told you I now manage his charitable foundation. That was also true. But I did not tell you that I loved him. Not professionally, not respectfully, but actually, desperately, hopelessly loved him for the entire duration of my employment." She delivers this confession in the same tone she might use to report an accounting discrepancy. Matter of fact, precise, stripped of sentiment, even as she describes sentiment itself. It is, Poirot thinks, the most courageous thing he has heard in this entire investigation. Not because the confession is dramatic, but because it is not. It is the quiet acknowledgement of a life spent in the shadow of an unrequited love, delivered without self-pity or theatrical suffering, with only the clean, sharp honesty of a woman who has decided that accuracy matters more than comfort. He never knew. Or if he knew, he was kind enough to pretend he did not. He was 63 when I began working for him, newly married to a woman half his age who was so beautiful that looking at her caused actual physical discomfort. And I was 35, plain, competent, the sort of person men notice only when their filing system requires organization. I understood my position. I accepted it. I performed my duties impeccably and permitted myself no expectations beyond a pension and perhaps a small bequest. She pauses, drinks her tea, continues with the same controlled precision. Instead, he left me the foundation. Not a sinecure, not a token position, but actual authority over the distribution of hundreds of thousands of pounds annually to charitable causes. He gave me power, Monsieur Poirot. The power to do good, to shape outcomes, to matter in a way I had never mattered before. It was the greatest gift I have ever received. And it came from a man who loved his wife, not his secretary. And why do you tell me this now? Because Lady Marguerite confessed something to you in that drawing room. I don't know the details. She has not spoken to me since your investigation concluded. But I watched her face when you spoke of Lord Harcourt's death. and I recognize guilt because I carry the same kind. Poirot does not speak. He waits. I was there, Monsieur Poirot, at Nice. I managed his calendar. I arranged his travel. I noticed when his digitalis prescription was not refilled on schedule, when his doctor's appointments were postponed, when the trip to Nice was planned despite his physician's explicit advice against it. I saw it happening. I saw her shaping circumstances, and I said nothing. I did nothing to prevent it. Her voice cracks for the first time, a small fracture in a structure that has held for 6 years, a single note of pain in what has otherwise been a performance of clinical detachment. Because I wanted him free of her. I told myself I was being professional, that it was not my place to interfere in his personal decisions. But the truth is that I wanted her to destroy herself through her own calculation. I wanted him to see what she was, and instead, he died, and she inherited everything. And I have lived for 6 years knowing that I could have prevented his death, or at least intervened, raised concerns, insisted his physician be consulted, and did not. Because some small, mean part of me hoped he would see the truth before the end. He did not. He died believing she loved him, and I helped make that death possible through my silence. Poirot rises, moves to the window, looks out at Hyde Park where people walk dogs and push perambulators and live lives untroubled by the weight of ancient guilt. The June light is generous, bathing the park in gold, and children run across the grass with the particular abandon of young creatures who have not yet learned that the world contains consequences. Mademoiselle Cross, he says, turning back to face her, you are confessing to a sin of omission. You saw danger and did not warn. You recognize manipulation and did not intervene. These are failures of action, not crimes of commission. And they are failures born not of malice but of love that could not express itself, and so turned inward, became passive, waited for circumstance to create the opportunity that courage could not manufacture. You are guilty of weakness, not of murder. There is a difference. Is there? The result is the same. Lord Harcourt died. The result is the same, Poirot agrees, but the cause is not. Lady Marguerite shaped circumstances actively. You permitted circumstances to develop passively. There is a moral distinction between action and inaction, between causing harm and failing to prevent it. The law recognizes this distinction, and so should you. I read philosophy at university, Monsieur Poirot. I know the arguments about action and omission. But sitting here in this flat, surrounded by the foundation he created, and I now manage, I cannot escape the knowledge that I had information and power, and did nothing. You seek absolution from me, mademoiselle, but I am not qualified to grant it. I can only tell you what I know. That human beings are imperfect instruments of morality, that we fail in ways large and small, and that the price of consciousness is the burden of remembering every failure with perfect clarity. You loved Lord Harcourt. You failed him. You have spent 6 years managing his legacy as penance. That is punishment enough. Evelyn looks down at her hands, those ink-stained, capable hands that have spent decades recording other people's transactions. The portrait, it bleeds for all of us, doesn't it? Not just for Lady Marguerite, for all of us who loved Lord Harcourt and failed him. Celeste's father, who loved Lady Marguerite and was paid to disappear. Thomas Webber, who loved his son and saw him destroyed. Lady Marguerite, who loves security more than honesty. Simon, who loves his father's memory more than his stepmother's welfare. And me, who loved Lord Harcourt and permitted his death through silence. We are all guilty. The portrait bleeds for all of us. Perhaps, Poirot says, or perhaps the portrait bleeds because John Singer Sargent was a genius who understood that all beauty contains guilt, that all perfection is built on compromise, and that the most honest portraits are those which admit, however subtly, that the subject is human, which means flawed, which means guilty of something. The particular guilt hardly matters. What matters is the acknowledgement that guilt exists. That is cold comfort. It is accurate comfort, which is the only kind worth having. He prepares to depart. At the door, he pauses. I will do nothing with this information, mademoiselle, as I did nothing with Lady Marguerite's confession, because both of you are guilty of the same offence, being human in circumstances that required perfection. And perfection is the one thing that cannot be demanded of people who are fundamentally, irreducibly imperfect. He bows slightly and leaves her standing in her doorway, surrounded by books and files, and the photograph of a young Lady Marguerite, laughing at something forever outside the frame. There is one more visit to make. Poirot does not plan it. He does not add it to his schedule or mention it to George. It occurs to him as he walks through Hyde Park in the late afternoon light, and he follows the impulse the way he has learned, over a long career, to follow all impulses that arrive without announcement, because they are often the conclusions his grey cells have reached before his conscious mind has assembled the reasoning. He returns to Chester Square. The butler, recognizing him, admits him without question. The drawing room is empty, the chairs still arranged in their semicircle from this morning's revelation, and, above the mantelpiece, the portrait. Poirot stands before it alone for the first time, without witnesses, without the need to perform observation for an audience. The room is quiet. The afternoon sun slants through the windows, striking the canvas at an angle that makes the painted eyes seem to follow him as he moves closer. He looks at the stain. It is, he sees now, beautiful. Not in the way that Lady Marguerite's face is beautiful, not with the beauty of youth or symmetry or the careful maintenance that wealth provides. Beautiful in the way that truth is beautiful, uncomfortable, demanding, impossible to look away from once it has been seen. The crimson spreads across the painted bodice like a flower opening, like a wound flowering, like a confession that has spent decades forming in the silence of a woman's heart and has finally, through the convergence of chemistry and grief and vengeance, found its way to the surface. 3 causes produced this stain. Sargent's oxidizing pigment, Celeste's heat, Weber's brush. 3 people who never met in the same room, the dead artist, the grieving granddaughter, the elderly painter, each adding their layer to a truth that none of them fully understood. And yet, the portrait is more than the sum of its causes. It is more than chemistry, more than revenge, more than the technical skill of a forger working in a dead man's style. It is, Poirot thinks, the most honest painting he has ever seen. Not because it tells the truth about Lady Marguerite, though it does, with a precision that is both cruel and compassionate, but because it tells the truth about all portraits, all performances, all the beautiful surfaces that human beings construct to hide the bleeding places within. He reaches out, not to touch the canvas, but to hover his hand an inch from the surface in the same gesture he observed Celeste make on the first day. The gesture of someone who knows what lies beneath the paint, but cannot quite bring themselves to make contact with it. Then he withdraws his hand, adjusts his cuffs, straightens his tie, and departs. Outside, London has progressed into early evening. The light has acquired that golden quality that makes even the city's grimiest corners appear momentarily transfigured, and as though the world is being seen through the same amber varnish that Sargent applied to his canvases. Warm, forgiving, and ultimately temporary. Poirot walks slowly back to Whitehaven Mansions, his stick tapping a precise rhythm on the pavement, his mind arranging final observations into the order they require. The case is complete. Not merely solved, but understood. The portrait bleeds because chemistry and grief and calculation have converged across decades to make it bleed. Multiple causes, multiple guilts, all expressing themselves through pigment and canvas, and the particular genius of an artist who knew that truth eventually demands visibility. Lady Marguerite will live with her bleeding portrait and the daily confrontation with her own conscience. A sentence more effective than any court could impose, because it is self-administered and therefore inescapable. Evelyn will live with her foundation and her silence, performing good works as penance for the one good work she failed to perform when it mattered most. Celeste will carry her father's grievance forward or set it down, as she chooses. And Poirot suspects she will set it down, because revenge, once achieved, is surprisingly light, and lighter still when it reveals truths the avenger never intended to uncover. Thomas Webber will write his scholarly article and perhaps find peace in contributing to knowledge rather than merely to vengeance. Simon will manage his bank and his resentments. Nicholas will continue his long, slow project of learning that charm is not a substitute for character, and that love, once lost through cowardice, is not easily recovered through persistence. And Poirot. He arrives at Whitehaven Mansions, hangs his hat on the stand with the precision of a man placing the final piece in a completed puzzle, adjusts a cushion that has become asymmetrical, repositions a book that was not quite parallel to the edge of the table. Small restorations of order in a world where order, in the larger sense, has proven elusive. Then he rings for George and requests that dinner be served precisely at 7 o'clock, with the clear soup he prefers and the particular arrangement of cutlery that allows him to eat without confronting disorder. Some mysteries, he reflects, are solved not by discovering who committed the crime, but by understanding why the crime needed to be committed at all. And some portraits bleed not because they are damaged, but because they are finally, after decades of silence, now telling the truth. The portrait bleeds. Multiple answers, all true, none complete. It will have to suffice. And there you have it. The bleeding portrait of Belgravia, a case in which the solution was not a single truth, but a palimpsest of truths, layered one upon another like the paint on that extraordinary canvas. Poirot always said that the most difficult mysteries were not the ones with too few clues, but the ones with too many, where every person is guilty of something, where every explanation is partially correct, and where the detective's task is not to find the needle in the haystack, but to determine which of several needles is the one that matters most. I asked him once, years later, whether the case had satisfied him. He gave me one of those looks. You know the ones I mean. How the look that makes you feel simultaneously valued and slightly pitiful, and said, "Hastings, you asked the wrong question. A case does not satisfy. A case instructs." And what this case instructed me is that the truth is not a destination. It is a landscape. One may survey it from many angles. Each angle reveals something. None reveals everything. And the greatest danger is not the hidden lie, but the comfortable truth. The truth that explains enough to make us stop looking for the truth that explains all. I confess I did not entirely understand him at the time. I think I understand him now. Or at least, I understand enough to know that understanding itself is incomplete, which is perhaps the most useful thing Poirot ever taught me, and the lesson I most often forget. If this case has moved you, troubled you, or exercised those grey cells of yours, we would be grateful if you would share the little grey cells with a friend. And if you find yourself standing before a portrait someday, your own or someone else's, take a moment to look closely at the shadows. Not all of them are painted by the artist. Some of them are painted by time and guilt and the slow insistence of truth upon visibility. Until next time, I am Arthur Hastings, wishing you clear eyes, sharp minds, and the courage to look at the portraits in your own life and ask what they are hiding. Good night.